Hello, hello, and welcome everyone and to our third and final webinar on sports diplomacy. My name is Elodie, and I am accompanied by my colleague Marcel, as well as four very interesting panelists, which we're going to introduce a bit later on. Today, our session is last session of our webinar series Beyond the Game, and we will dive into a fascinating topic and talk about the intersection between sports and city diplomacy by taking the Paris Olympics as a case study. And we will be seeing how mega sporting events such as the Olympics enhance a city's soft power and contribute to global cooperation. We are extremely pleased to have with us four leading experts in the field with very interesting insights and very different backgrounds. And yes, while our first two webinars were led by single experts, we have decided to wrap up this webinar series with a panel discussion. So before I hand over the floor to our panelists, I will quickly walk you through how today's session will be unfolding. So first, I will be giving a quick introduction about UNITAR and the division I work in, which is the Division for Multilateral Diplomacy. After that, my colleague Marcel will formally introduce our guest speakers, Judith, Etsuko, Lindsay, and Lorenzo. And following the panel discussion, we will open the floor for a Q&A session where you are all more than welcome to ask your questions, which you can submit in the Q&A chat box, which is just at the bottom of your screen. So moving on to UNITAR and the Division for Multilateral Diplomacy. And I am just sharing my screen to make sure that everyone is able to see our screen. One second. There we go. Apologies for that. So moving on to UNITAR and our Division for Multilateral Diplomacy. UNITAR is essentially the dedicated training arm of the United Nations, focused on enhancing the effectiveness of the United Nations through dedicated capacity building, training initiatives, and research. Our organization was founded in the early 60s during this period of significant decolonization. New states were emerging and joining the UN, and so they kind of needed the tools to navigate this complex system. And that's where UNITAR came in to provide the necessary diplomatic training to these new members. Today, while we still focus on diplomatic training, we also have expanded our activities. We now offer training and learning solutions, not just for diplomats, but also for individuals, organizations, the private sector, NGOs, and universities. And my division, which is the Division for Multilateral Diplomacy, has a very clear mission, which is to strengthen multilateralism and the UN system by implementing training programs that focus on skills development and capacity building. And we have also now decided to expand our activities to sports diplomacy. And so moving on to today's topic, which is sports and city diplomacy, today's conversation is all about understanding the strategic role that cities play in fostering international cooperation. While the Paralympics are still ongoing, we will be looking at the Paris Summer Olympics, which ended recently. And by taking the Paris Olympics as a case study, we will be looking at how these kind of mega sporting events are used by cities to enhance their soft power, promote sustainability, create economic opportunities. Now, with all this being said, it is my pleasure to pass on the floor to my colleague Marcel, who's going to be introducing our four panelists today. And Marcel, I think you have to unmute yourself.
There we
Thank you
go.
very much.
That would be it. That would be it. So yeah, thank you so much, Elodie, and it's a pleasure to have all of you here joining us for our final webinar on kind of sports diplomacy, now looking at city diplomacy and working with this fantastic panel of experts to really reflect on the Paris Olympic Games as a case study for city diplomacy. And what we mean by city diplomacy will be elaborated first. So the way we'll kind of structure this is we'll be looking at some broad questions on city diplomacy, how it can influence kind of the social fabric and kind of international partnerships. And then we'll be also looking at specific questions on the Paris Olympic Games in and of itself. So without further ado, we'll get right into the the questions. But before that, we'll just briefly introduce our panelists for today. So with us, we have Dr. Lorenzo Kilgangrandi, who is the founding director at the City Diplomacy Lab. Now, Lorenzo has significant academic roles and also advises international organizations, national governments, city networks, and municipalities on how to fully unfold the added value of city diplomacy in their policies. And today he'll be sharing some insights on the essential components of city diplomacy, specifically related to the field of sport. Likewise, we have Dr. Lindsay Sarah Krasnov, another representative of academia today, and also a key thinker and an expert when it comes to the field of sports diplomacy. Lindsay's a visiting clinical assistant professor at the New York University Tisch Institute for Global Sports, and she serves as a global communications and sports consultant, a speaker, and a historian with a specific focus on Franco-American relations. Lindsay's worked primarily on basketball diplomacy, as well as the role of sports in shaping international relations. Now, our final two speakers also include Ms. Judith Rowan, who is representing kind of the private sector here. She serves as the Global Host Cities Director at the London-based consultancy firm Major Events International, specializing in international sports partnerships and events. Judith really looks at how these events can maximize returns on investment for host regions, sports federations, and rights holders. So today she'll be showing us a little bit more and telling us a bit more about some of the economic opportunities and risks which are associated to mega sporting events. And last but not least, we have Ms. Atsuko Yamada, who we must recognize is currently based in Japan. And so it's very late for Atsuko. It's an honor to have her joining us here today. Atsuko is representing a more the national sporting organization perspective. She's currently the head of international sport for development at the Japan Sport Council and is a member of the supervisory committee that evaluates the impact and legacy strategy for the Paris 2024 Olympics, as well as working with the sport and development platform. So we really have a wonderful panel here today, and we have to thank our panelists for being able to join us and to share their insights into this very important field. I think if we close the presentation and if we go right into the discussions, I'd like to first open with a question for Lorenzo. Lorenzo, if you can please tell us, what is city diplomacy? What would be its core components, and what's the evolution? How has it evolved in recent years?
Thank you very much, Marcel and Elodie, and also many thanks for the opportunity to meet with you and exchange ideas with my distinguished colleagues. And I believe this first question is very appropriate because outside of the circles of those who study it or practice it, city diplomacy is still little known. It deserves some explanations, and very glad to do it. Well, city diplomacy is the management of international partnerships by municipalities and other local governments. And this takes the form of relationship with other cities, foreign cities, both bilaterally, for example, in twinning agreements, or multilaterally with a network of cities, but also with other actors, which includes NGOs, international organizations, national development agencies, and international banks. And the reason why cities and local governments conduct this kind of partnership can be found in actually the three layers of evolution of this practice. It has almost a little more than 1 century of history, and when it started in the 1910s, city diplomacy had a clear focus on helping those cities who needed the most. The idea was to provide a technical and sometimes even financial support for cities that are experiencing some difficulty, some troubling times, can be as a result of the war. It was the case of the Second World War, where we saw the blossoming of twinning agreements connecting former enemies, which says a lot about this moral base of city diplomacy, as well as a tool to navigate the very harsh and difficult decolonization process, keeping a connection between territories, including those of the former colonizing and former colonized countries. In the 90s, you can see the emergence of new actors in city diplomacy as the world embarked in a phenomenon of economic globalization and the spread of neoliberalism. These new protagonists are cities that are located in fast-paced economies, including those in the global south, in Africa, Latin America, Asia. And the goal here of city diplomacy is to foster economic growth, job creation on both sides. It's the idea of really benefiting from the openness of borders and the global economy. And in 2015, coinciding with the introduction of the Agenda 2030 with its Sustainable Development Goals, we can see that cities really embrace this new philosophy offered by the United Nations, where basically the first two steps are merged in the idea that values and interests can be pursued jointly. And this is about tackling those challenges that are perceived as global challenges, and they range from climate action to fight poverty and malnutrition to ensuring fair and equitable living conditions to everyone. And I conclude here because this opens up, in fact, to the core topics of collaboration, international collaboration, which are linked to global events and the Olympic Games.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo. And you talk about how city diplomacy can help the wider community as well. And I think that will tie nicely into a question for Etsuko. If you could perhaps shed some light on how these initiatives might be able to kind of support and perhaps influence, how would they influence or impact the social fabric within the host city?
Thank you, Marcel. It's a great pleasure to be here today. Well, to your questions, I think it can be an opportunity for the host city to align its social system and local policies with the international standards or international policies, especially in the realm of human rights, social inclusion, and the global agenda, including the Sustainable Development Goals, through the bidding, preparation, and hosting of sporting events. For example, there are many affected groups and those at risk of human rights related to hosting an event, such as people residing near the location of the event, including those who live on the streets and refugees, migrant workers, persons with disabilities, and so on. So the host city is always in the eyes of the international community and is therefore expected to behave in accordance with international standards. And of course, nowadays, local people feel that it's not enough for the host city to prepare a place for athletes to compete. The local population, including those who don't like sport or have little interest in it, should benefit from hosting a sport event by shifting to a more social inclusion society, human rights related considered society, and so on. So this could be a paradigm shift for a host city if it designs, delivers, and evaluates an event appropriately, I think.
Wonderful. And perhaps looking away from the social side of things and more about the economic factors and associated to this. Judith, what can you tell us in terms of the ways in which cities can leverage international partnerships, both to address global challenges through city diplomacy?
Sure. Thank you, Marcel, and thank you, Elodie. It's a privilege to be here today and to contribute to this discussion. Ultimately, it's about advocacy and amplification. It's also about a melding of diverse cultural and geographic viewpoints, which serve ultimately to enrich the discussion and the approach of alliances. And these increase the impact and universal effectiveness of the outcomes then. Collaborative problem solving across diverse international landscapes and working together with international counterparts can create powerful solutions to global challenges. And we've seen this through climate change, and we saw it with the recent COVID-19 outbreak, where there was public health issues also, where we collaborated and came up with global solutions. So through intercity diplomacy, cities can amplify their voices and collectively advocate for that change, especially on the global stage, and therein influencing policies and decisions that will impact global challenges. So it's about information sharing, it's about benchmarking and sharing best practice, and via those international partnerships, host cities learn from each other and then can advance and grow ultimately. Overall, we know that cultural exchange and fostering mutual understanding, especially today, and especially empathy, is becoming more and more crucial for stability, increasingly in a polarized international society, in a national polarized society, and internationally. So it's become all the more important in these recent times, which are more troubled perhaps than our previous decades.
Absolutely, and I couldn't agree more. You know, a lot of the topics that we've been discussing in this webinar series has been how we can use sports to improve international relations and bring people together. And you know, maybe going back into the theory, I think it'll be good to hear from Lindsay. If you can tell us a little bit about how mega sporting events in particular help cities to enhance their soft power, and also how this can then evolve towards becoming a catalyst for global cooperation.
Great question, Marcel, and thanks to you and Elodie and the team for organizing this great conversation. You know, and it again, you know, playing off of what Judith just mentioned, it is a lot about the cultural exchanges that sports diplomacy, and particularly these global sporting mega events, can foster under the larger framework of city diplomacy. But it's also the technical and knowledge exchanges too. Right? If we think about kind of the three ways of engagement of sports diplomacy and city diplomacy within this context, the cultural, the technical, and the knowledge exchanges. And, you know, we've seen that with so many of the recent examples, and certainly Paris 2024 is the most vital one of that. But, you know, city diplomacy within the context of global sporting events adds or enhances a different layer of sports diplomacy. So it builds on what Simon Rofe calls the network of networks that sports diplomacy fosters. It helps to empower different types of sports diplomacy actors to engage and to have agency. And I think so often when people think of sports diplomacy, or when they hear the term sports diplomacy, they think solely within the context of geopolitics or the official federal government level credentialed diplomats or representatives. And that is part of sports diplomacy. But the vast majority of sports diplomacy that occurs in our day and age in the 2020s occurs at other different types of layers within this larger international society of sport, as Stuart Murray calls it, those that help to make the global sports world, including the Olympic and Paralympic movement, run and tick. And we see that at the city-to-city level, particularly with the interlinked Paris-LA Summer Games, which was part of the unusual host city bid award in 2017 by the IOC. The first time in over 100 years that two host cities were awarded at the same time, but very much with the stipulation that they work in new, tightly cooperative ways. And I think this gives us a lot of different examples of how city diplomacy through this global sports events framework can really add to the conversation. Gives more agency to more localized stakeholders. And in doing that, it helps to build greater authenticity of the diplomatic engagements and outcomes, especially over the longue durée. You know, one of the things we emphasize in sports diplomacy is that having a win, it's very rare that you have that instantaneously. Like most diplomacy, it's the longer sustained efforts. And I think city diplomacy through the sports diplomacy context does allow that, because once the event is over, and we're going to see this with the Paris Games, that cooperation at a city-to-city level doesn't end, right? There's a sustained bridge and growth, and it has the opportunity to continue once the events in question are over. And so it provides a new, not new, but a different type of engagement and sustainability over time, while also allowing cities to communicate, represent, and negotiate about themselves to foreign publics, but also perhaps to domestic publics in just ways that most other events do not facilitate in the same way. So those are just kind of a few starter ideas to throw out in terms of how city diplomacy can fit in within the global sports framework.
Absolutely, and what you touch upon there, Lindsay, is a very important theme that's maybe not explored so much, is para-diplomacy. Looking at it from the lower levels and the regional perspective as well. You see Wales releasing their own sports diplomacy strategy as well very recently, and many actors at the regional level. For example, in Spain, you have the Basque Country and Catalonia, very, very prominent in their respective fields as well, and showing how it's a bit more decentralized. It doesn't necessarily have to be seen through one kind of perspective. Linked to what you were saying, there is how city diplomacy influences or how it can be leveraged in, for example, sporting events. And so I'd like to direct a question to Lorenzo, going back to you, is what is the kind of relevance of city diplomacy in the framework of global events such as the Paris Olympic Games? Now, this should hopefully tie into a bit more specific questions on Paris, and we'll get into that after.
Thank you, Marcel, for the question. And in fact, building on what Lindsay was saying, there is a strong connection between city diplomacy and sport diplomacy, and the Olympic Games really encapsulates this sort of connection. We can see that this relevance of city diplomacy precedes the Olympic Games, is evident during them, and also is very, very important in the aftermath, in the legacy period. The first part, Lindsay was mentioning it, it's an important element is knowledge exchange, learning from cities. This is how, in fact, city diplomacy proves to be a channel for information that would make the bid or the application of the city, the aspiring host city, solid and convincing. And city diplomats, that are those municipal officers that work together with the mayor or the city leader in the international connection of the city, have to make a case for this, have to be convincing, have to connect with those organizations that are in charge of overseeing the bidding or application process, and eventually to choose which city will host the event. So it's a channel role that city diplomacy plays in the first steps of the procedure. Then if the city is successful in being nominated or elected host city, it's a lot of work that also city diplomats have to implement. And this includes also leveraging the international attention linked to the Olympic Games. There is a strong connection between how the city positions itself with foreign actors and the foreign media. So there is a strong connection between the foreign office, the international relations office, and the press office of the municipality to make sure there is a coherent presentation. Then you have a lot of delegations coming into the city, national delegations, local delegations, international organizations. We've seen them on television. These are opportunities for the cities to sign new agreements, revamp existing projects, and brand itself even more strongly with the core topics of its application. These are recently revolving around social justice and environmental justice. And this was the case, for example, of Paris, the municipality of Paris, that took the opportunity to organize global events involving mayors from across the world to make sure that the expertise, the vision, and the implementation of its vision during the Olympic Games received a global vision and create potential opportunities for further partnerships. And then somehow the city diplomats are also the guardians of the achievements during the Olympic Games. They are in charge of maintaining high the international attention on the city by putting an accent in future interactions on the expertise, on the best practices, on the achievements, both in the physical space, but also in the capacity. And the city becomes somehow a teacher for the future cities that might want to apply and bid for becoming host city for global events. So in a nutshell, basically, we can see that city diplomacy is needed to access the status of host city, but these global events, the sport events, they're also accelerating city diplomacy and empowering the use of city diplomacy by cities to go towards their development goals.
Thank you, Lorenzo, and I like how you put that, how the city diplomats are almost the stewards of success as well, and how they need to use that and leverage that when they move forward with their respective roles and positions. And maybe I think Etsuko would then be naturally very well positioned to answer our next question on in what ways Paris was able to successfully implement sustainable practices. Given your role in the various committees as such, and what can future host cities learn from Paris in terms of from the sustainability approach?
Thank you. I think there are several key points to their success in terms of sustainability. First of all, Paris tried to utilize this opportunity to maximize not only its environmental impact, but also its economic and social impact. Regarding the economic impact, as one of the pillars of Paris 2024 legacy is to deliver games that boost regional growth and attractiveness. They had opened up the games markets to all companies, with particular attention paid to small and medium-sized enterprises from the bidding phase. For example, the platform was launched in 2018, which informs and advises companies wishing to bid for the games contracts. And in the end, more than 18,850 companies were registered on this platform. And 75% of Paris 2024 suppliers are small and medium-sized enterprise. I think it's a good result. And secondly, some initiatives have included a useful mechanism to strongly encourage people to change their behavior. So if you had a chance to walk around Paris during the Olympic Games, you must have noticed free water fountains here and there to ensure that no spectators was offered the plastic bottles and to develop alternatives to single-use plastics. It's not that easy to change people's awareness, and it's much more difficult to change their behavior. By taking an example of Tokyo 2020 legacy, the percentage of Tokyo residents who are interested in para sports rose to 53% in 2021, compared to 44% in 2022. However, it decreased to 43% again in 2022, the year after, the same level before the games. And getting back to Paris case, I saw many people actually use the water fountains by forming a queue. And thirdly, this is the most important point, I think. The monitoring and evaluation elements were embedded from the outset in terms of legacy and sustainability. A common framework and indicators for measuring the impact of the games were defined. For example, using sport to combat discrimination and promote inclusion is one of the pillars of the legacy and sustainability strategy of Paris 2024. And changes in the perception of stereotypes and behavior by project beneficiaries is one of the indicators to assess it. And regarding the second question, depending on host cities, I understand that social problems and challenges they face differ. Therefore, future host cities need clear vision and a legacy and sustainability strategy that explains to the public how they intend to use a sporting event as a tool to address their own issues. That's what I can say at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Atsuko. And I think if we turn now to Lindsay, and if you can dive into a little bit about the specific challenges that you believe Paris faced during the 2024 Olympics, and what lessons can we learn from these as well? Maybe Atsuko's already spoken a little about the sustainability side of things. If there's any other thoughts you have on the matter.
Certainly. So, I think any games, any sporting mega event has kind of a standard set of challenges that they confront: security, transportation. I think one of the things that just to kind of open up the conversation that perhaps we can pull apart a little bit more in the Q&A, is that one of the other challenges that Paris 2024 faced was kind of this twin poles of public skepticism that the city could pull it off and could pull it off in the way that had been promised, as well as a perceived dying brand of the games and the movement overall. And I think that there were a variety of different strategies that were employed to try to target and troubleshoot these two particular challenges. And I think so far it's hard to render an assessment because the Paralympics are set to begin next week. And so I think to really have a better handle of it, we would need to have that information and experience as well to inform. But thus far, it seems like Paris has done a fairly good job about kind of poking holes in public skepticism, both domestic as well as foreign skepticism, that they could pull off the the audacious concept of a games-wide open approach to hosting events throughout the city. So outside of stadiums and around historic landmarks and cultural areas that have certain resonance either with certain sports or with certain aspects of Parisian history, its culture, and its renown. And I think what they were able to do with that in a way that perhaps gets us to think about what sporting mega events can do for city diplomacy in new ways is to really present a kind of a fresher version of what Paris is in terms of how it communicates, negotiates, and represents, perhaps also to itself and not just the rest of the world. Think about what you thought about Paris, say, prior to July 26th, and how did the opening ceremonies and subsequent Olympics, 2 weeks of Olympic spectacles, how has that perhaps already shifted or impacted a little bit how you thought about the city itself? So we have that sort of idea, and that feeds into the other challenge of, how to use what was perceived as a dying brand of a global sporting event and to try to infuse new energy or excitement into it. And I think so far at this halfway point, that's been fairly well done. And I think it speaks to the city, but also to the larger movement itself. There's certainly, of course, other challenges that Paris 24 faced, particularly one of its biggest legacy promises, the cleaning up of the Seine River, to the point that it could be swimmable and used for some of the events. And depending on the day and the weather, there's various, results on that. But I think they have shown that that hosting global sporting events can be the kind of the political lubricant for such large infrastructure projects that benefit the city, its population, and other areas around it, and will for the longer term, right? When we talk about sustainability in a different sense, this is one of the, without the pressure and the high profile nature of hosting the games and having this pledge to clean up the Seine River and everything that went into it, kind of as, you know, it's something that has been talked about for decades, but finally really had the impetus once it was tied to the Paris Games. So those are, I think, just a few of the examples of the challenges that Paris faced, and some of the lessons we can take away from this is that it can, you know, such challenges can help to enter into new eras of public infrastructures, of rebranding or refreshing kind of a city image, and also foreign company and public perceptions of how they might be able to build new partnerships or work together based on some of those ideas. The last thing I would also plant is that, you know, Paris has helped to foster far closer cooperation with LA and American officials and stakeholders than previously. You know, we talk about France being the United States' oldest ally, and that the partnership has long been very close, even though they have not seen eye to eye on many different things. But, you know, there's ample evidence now that what the interlinked Paris-LA Games have done thus far, and, you know, we're still, you know, at the halfway point, is to force far greater and far closer cooperation in ways that had not previously existed in the French-American partnership at any level. But it's particularly at the city-to-city level that we see that in terms of security, police, logistics, the organization team that's been embedded with Paris 20, the LA team that's been embedded with Paris 24 for quite some time. And new ways of thinking of, well, if this, you know, certainly if this is how Paris is doing things as LA, here's how we might be able to integrate some of that within our natural, you know, DNA, and take some of their, you know, take the best of what's working and implement it within a more local context. So really that knowledge sharing that we don't hear as much about because it's often out of the media spotlight, but the knowledge exchange has really been what has propelled a far closer cooperation through the Paris example.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Lindsay. And you're absolutely right. You know, seeing the collaboration with Paris, with LA, and also even Brisbane, it's really, that's why we're here. That's why we're talking about this matter. And I hope that everyone's found, you know, the questions interesting, the responses are even interesting and insightful so far. We have one final question. And that's for Judith. And, you know, we're looking again at the legacy, at the impact of mega sporting events, for example, in cities like Paris. So Judith, what can you tell us now, looking also concretely, particularly in terms of economic opportunities and risks, and the fulfillment of the Sustainable Development Goals with regards to the long-term impacts of these mega events?
Yeah, thank you, Marcel. I think the long-term impacts can vary widely depending on how effectively the games are managed and planned, and also how far ahead they are also planned in advance. And of course, there are other variables, including economic conditions, political stability, public support for the games. But one of the most measurable long-term benefits or impacts is always going to be infrastructure. And in Paris in particular, public authorities extended the transport network to facilitate access between venues. And of course, benefits like that will be long felt in the city. That infrastructure will serve the local Parisians beyond the games. I also think the economic boost that is so often talked about in the Olympics, I mean, the IOC predicted the economic boost to be somewhere between 9 and 12 billion pounds for the city. Of course, we know that the cost of the Olympics was around about 9 billion as well. So it's obvious why economists would argue that the Olympics could easily become financially untenable for any host city. But the long-term multiplier effect of that and the investment, 95% of which came from private investors for Paris, will continue to stimulate Paris long beyond 2024. So I think that's very important. But it's down to how the city manages that and turns that legacy into a positive for the city long term. We also know that the Games present a tremendous tourism boost for Paris, for any host city at the time it's hosted. I think there was 11 million tourists counted in Paris over that 2-week period, which is phenomenal. But in the long term, you want to be sure that those people are going to come back, that Paris has been presented, the brand, the city has been presented in such a way that's going to attract international tourists in the future. And when we look to the Olympics in 2012, Visit Britain in 2013, or in the Games in the years after the Olympics in the UK, they reported tourism boosts and a boost in visitor figures beyond 2012. So we know that there is return tourism that results from the Olympics, which is a great legacy and long-term impact. And of course, there's the all-important sporting legacy. These events stimulate grassroots and increase sports participation at a local level, which is crucial. So bringing it back to the Sustainable Development Goals, a lot of what I say will lean to what Etsuko has been discussing. And that is ultimately that the Games pledge to be the greenest in history. And of course, they certainly managed to halve the carbon imprint or footprint of previous Games, which was very significant. And within that, one of the most important aspects probably contributing to that figure was the fact that they repurposed existing sports facilities in the city, which was tremendous. And of course, avoiding the white elephants of previous hostings in the past. There were many other notable sustainable achievements by Paris around responsible consumption and production. And Etsuko mentioned single-use plastic and the availability of water around the city as well. And one of the loveliest statistics that I found was that of the 2 million pieces of sports equipment that were used, 75% of those were owned by federations and sport federations prior to that. So they again have been reused. So I suppose in summary, there's no doubt that previous Olympics have had a dramatic impact on in a negative way. Carbon footprint wise, we're all learning. Each edition of the Games is learning and improving. But Paris was determined to make a difference, and they managed at least to turn the dial so far, and that's very important. And I think over longer term impacts can be positive in terms of sustainable development, as long as they're managed effectively, as long as there is a consideration of the risks. And of course there are many, but these challenges need to be very carefully considered and addressed. And ultimately it's about striving to learn from previous editions of the game, to nurture those collaborations with previous hosts like Tokyo and future hosts like LA, which Paris has done so well by working closely with both, and of course working with other organizers of the Games previously, to ensure that the Games continue to evolve in a positive manner and in a positive trajectory.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Judith. I think that really kind of encapsulates a lot of the topics that we've been discussing in this short webinar. It's been a real pleasure to have all of you speak and to hear these different insights, and also just the diversity of viewpoints is something that we're really grateful for. Of course, looking at all the different areas of this, from the social to the economic to the sustainable, and also the theoretical, of course. So thank you so much to our speakers.